The winter wind howled at 40 below outside Ezra Coldwell's cabin while he sat in shirt sleeves reading by firelight, his fire reduced to embers hours ago. 300 yards away, Hiram Rafferty burned his sixth log of the evening and still couldn't stop shivering. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The thermometer outside Ezra Coldwell's cabin read 22 degrees below zero on the morning of January 15, 1843. Inside, the air temperature held at 46 degrees above zero. Ezra had let his fire die down to coals 4 hours earlier, and the cabin still maintained enough warmth that he could sit comfortably without his heavy coat. 68 degrees of difference between outside and inside, maintained with minimal fuel consumption. 300 yards down the creek, Hiram Rafferty was burning his 8th log since dawn and still couldn't get his cabin above freezing. His fingers were numb as he fed another split piece of pine into his fireplace. The fire roared, consuming wood at a rate that would deplete his winter supply by March if the cold continued. Outside temperature, 22 below. Inside temperature, maybe 32 degrees if he stood directly in front of the flames. Hiram had been watching Ezra's cabin all winter with growing resentment and confusion. The structure looked absurd. It had a strange wooden tower rising from the center of the roof, constructed from horizontal slats with gaps between them like an old corncrib, which was exactly what it was. Ezra had built his entire cabin around an abandoned corncrib, and the whole settlement had laughed at him for it. They called it Coldwell's folly. They predicted he would freeze to death in his ridiculous contraption. But Ezra wasn't freezing. His chimney produced a thin wisp of smoke, compared to the thick columns pouring from every other cabin in the area. He used half the firewood of his neighbors, and somehow, impossibly, his cabin stayed warm. Hiram pulled his coat tighter and added another log to his fire. He had been trapping in these mountains for 9 years. He knew how cabins worked. You built 4 walls, a roof, a fireplace, and you burned enough wood to stay alive through winter. That was the equation. There was no secret to it. Except Ezra had changed something, and Hiram couldn't figure out what. Jethro Crane had visited Ezra's cabin in December and reported that the man was comfortable in temperatures that should have been uninhabitable. The warmth lingered hours after the fire died down. Heat seemed to stay trapped inside those walls in a way that defied normal experience. Hiram had watched. He had counted the logs in Ezra's woodpile at the start of winter and watched it diminish at half the rate of his own supply. He had observed the thin smoke from Ezra's chimney during the coldest nights. He had seen Ezra working outside in temperatures that drove other men indoors, moving with the casual comfort of someone who knew a warm cabin waited for him. The mystery gnawed at Hiram, and what made it worse was remembering how he had mocked Ezra during construction, how he had laughed at the corncrib tower. Now, shivering in front of his fire, while Ezra sat warm 300 yards away, Hiram wondered who the fool really was. The Rocky Mountain fur trade had entered its twilight years by 1838, though the trappers working the high country tributaries didn't know it yet. Beaver pelts still commanded decent prices at the summer rendezvous, enough to justify another season in the wilderness. Men came west for different reasons. Some sought fortune, others freedom from civilization's constraints. A few simply couldn't function in settled society. The mountains accepted them all with equal indifference. Ezra Coldwell had arrived in the Rockies in 1834 at age 23. He came from Pennsylvania, where his father had taught him carpentry and basic engineering principles before dying of pneumonia. Ezra had worked construction in Philadelphia for 2 years before deciding he wanted distance from cities, crowds, and the industrial smoke that hung over eastern manufacturing centers. The fur trade offered an escape. He was competent, but not exceptional. His first 3 seasons yielded average catches. He survived without major injury or illness, which already placed him ahead of many who tried mountain life. He learned to read weather, set trap lines efficiently, and avoid the worst dangers: grizzly bears, winter cold, accidents, and occasional hostile encounters with various tribes protecting their territory killed trappers regularly. Ezra understood these risks as the cost of the life he had chosen. Winter was the most dangerous season. Temperatures in the high valleys could drop to 40 below zero and stay there for weeks. Standard frontier cabins offered minimal protection. Most trappers built them quickly using whatever timber was convenient: four walls of notched logs, mud or moss, chinking between gaps, a simple door, maybe a rawhide covered window opening, and a basic fireplace. The structures kept out wind and heavy snow. That was enough for most purposes, but barely enough. Every winter, trappers died from the cold. Some froze in their cabins when fires went out during the night, and they couldn't wake in time to restart them. Others survived but lost fingers and toes to frostbite. A few simply burned through their entire winter firewood supply by February and had to abandon their trap lines, losing a season's potential income. The mathematics of winter survival were brutal and simple. You needed shelter, fuel, and enough physical resilience to endure months of cold that could kill you in hours if your defenses failed. Ezra had survived 4 winters before 1838. Each year he had burned enormous quantities of firewood, waking multiple times each night to feed his fire. Even with constant burning, his cabin's interior temperature rarely climbed above 40 degrees. 6 feet from the fireplace, the air was cold enough to freeze water. He slept in heavy furs and woke with frost in his beard. He accepted this as normal. Every trapper he knew lived the same way. Cold cabins were simply a reality of mountain winters. You endured them because the alternative was returning to civilization, and most mountain men would rather freeze than submit to that fate. Ezra had never questioned whether cabins could be built differently, until 1838, when Lemuel Thorne's death forced him to question everything. Ezra met Lemuel Thorne at the 1837 summer rendezvous near the Green River. Lemuel was 41 years old, originally from Massachusetts, with 15 years of mountain experience. He had trapped most of the major river systems in the Rockies and knew the country as well as any man alive. He was looking for a partner after his previous companion had retired to St. Louis. Ezra was working alone and struggling with the workload. They agreed to partner for the upcoming season. The partnership worked well. Lemuel's experience complemented Ezra's youth and strength. They established a winter camp in a valley along a tributary of the Yellowstone River in what would later become southwestern Montana. The location offered good beaver populations, adequate timber for firewood and construction, and enough isolation to avoid competition from other trappers. They built a standard cabin in 5 days during late September, using techniques Lemuel had employed for years. The cabin measured roughly 14 feet by 16 feet inside. They used pine logs averaging 10 inches in diameter, notched at corners in the traditional saddle notch pattern. The gaps between logs were chinked with a mixture of mud and moss that Lemuel insisted worked better than mud alone. They built a simple stone fireplace in one corner, constructing it from flat rocks gathered from a nearby creek. The door was made from split planks held together with cross pieces hung on leather hinges. They cut one small window opening and covered it with scraped deerskin that allowed some light to filter through. The roof consisted of poles laid across the walls, covered with bark and a layer of sod. The entire structure was typical of 1830s mountain construction. It took less than a week to build and used materials entirely from the immediate area. It would keep out rain, snow, and wind. It provided a base for their trapping operations. By the standards of the time and place, it was adequate shelter. They spent October and November running their trap lines, processing pelts, and preparing for deep winter. Lemuel was a methodical worker who taught Ezra techniques for improving pelt quality and identifying the most productive trapping locations. They worked well together, settling into an efficient routine. By early December, They had accumulated nearly 200 beaver pelts, a respectable catch that would bring good money at the next summer's rendezvous. Winter arrived in force during mid-December. Temperatures dropped and stayed below zero for days at a time. The men stayed close to the cabin, venturing out only to check nearby traps and gather firewood. They burned wood constantly. The fireplace consumed logs at an alarming rate, and even with fire roaring, the cabin's interior remained cold. They wore heavy clothing indoors and slept under multiple layers of fur blankets. On the morning of January 9, 1838, the temperature outside was 34 degrees below zero. Inside the cabin, with the fire burning steadily, the air temperature was perhaps 35 degrees above zero. Lemuel and Ezra woke before dawn as usual. They had a simple breakfast of venison and coffee. Lemuel mentioned he wanted to check several traps. Ezra offered to go with him, but Lemuel said one man could handle the task. The traps were only a mile from camp, an easy walk even in the cold. Lemuel, dressed in his warmest clothing, took his rifle and left the cabin around 8 in the morning. Ezra stayed behind to work on stretching frames for pelts they had taken the previous week. He kept the fire burning and expected Lemuel back by midday. Noon came and passed. Ezra began to worry, but told himself the traps might have held beaver, which would slow Lemuel's return. By 2 in the afternoon, with daylight already fading, Ezra knew something was wrong. He dressed in his heavy furs, loaded his rifle, and headed out to follow Lemuel's tracks in the snow. He found Lemuel 1.5 miles from the cabin, near one of their trap sets along a frozen creek. The older man was lying in the snow, his rifle beside him. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of animal attack or other violence. Lemuel had simply stopped moving and died. Ezra knelt beside his partner's body. Lemuel's face was peaceful, his eyes closed. The cold had killed him so efficiently that he looked like he might wake up if shaken, but his body was frozen solid, rigid as stone. Ezra tried to understand what had happened. Had Lemuel fallen through the ice? There was no wet clothing. Had he been injured? No blood, no obvious wounds. Had he suffered some kind of sudden illness? The answer was simpler and more terrible. Lemuel had been checking the trap line during the coldest part of the day. At some point, probably while bending over to examine a trap, he had overexerted himself. The extreme cold had stressed his heart or lungs. He had collapsed, and in temperatures of 34 below zero, unconsciousness meant death within minutes. The cold had taken him so quickly he probably never realized he was dying. Ezra spent the rest of that afternoon getting Lemuel's body back to the cabin. The frozen corpse was heavy and difficult to move. By the time Ezra returned to camp, dragging Lemuel on a makeshift sled, it was full dark and the temperature had dropped even further. Ezra was exhausted and nearly frostbitten himself. He got inside, rebuilt the fire, and sat with Lemuel's body through the night. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave. Ezra spent the next day gathering stones and building a cairn on a hillside above the creek. He wrapped Lemuel in blankets and placed the body in the cairn, covering it with rocks to protect it from scavengers. It was the best burial he could manage in frozen ground. That night, back in the cabin alone, Ezra sat by the fire and faced the mathematics of his situation. He was alone in the wilderness with 4 months of winter remaining. The cabin felt colder than it had before, though the temperature was no different. Ezra spent the week after Lemuel's death processing the implications of what had happened. The immediate cause was clear enough. Extreme cold, physical exertion, and age had combined to kill his partner. But Ezra kept returning to a detail that bothered him. Lemuel had been less than 2 miles from the cabin when he died, 2 miles from shelter and warmth. If the cabin had been able to hold heat longer, if returning to it didn't require such perfect timing, would Lemuel have survived? He began paying attention to how the cabin behaved. Every morning, he let the fire die down to test how long warmth persisted. The results were consistent and discouraging. With a good fire burning, the interior temperature might reach 40 degrees. The moment he stopped feeding wood, the temperature began dropping. Within 2 hours, the cabin was barely above freezing. Within 4 hours, water left in a cup would develop ice. The walls were the problem. Ezra could see daylight through gaps in the chinking. Wind pushed through those gaps constantly, drawing warm air out and pulling cold air in. The logs themselves, even where they fit tightly, conducted cold from outside to inside. He would place his hand on the interior wall and feel coldness radiating through solid wood. Heat escaped through every surface. The roof leaked warmth upward. The door let cold seep around its edges. The window was worse, just deerskin stretched over an opening. Other trappers accepted these limitations. Cabins were cold. You burned more wood. That was the solution everyone used. But Ezra's mind kept circling back to the central problem. A cabin should protect you from the environment. It should create a barrier between deadly cold and survivable warmth. The structure he was living in barely qualified as a barrier. It was more like a windbreak with a roof. He started visiting other trappers' cabins within a day's travel, making excuses about checking trap lines or trading supplies. Every cabin he saw was built the same way. Notched logs, mud chinking, minimal door and window protection. Every cabin was cold. Every trapper burned enormous amounts of firewood and still shivered through the winter nights. The pattern was universal, which meant everyone accepted it as inevitable. But Ezra had learned carpentry from his father, who had taught him that every construction problem had a solution if you understood the principles involved. The principle here was heat retention. Warmth was escaping too quickly. The question was how to slow that escape. He thought about buildings in Philadelphia. Brick buildings with thick walls stayed warmer than wooden buildings, but brick required materials and skills unavailable in the wilderness. Stone buildings were warmer than log cabins, but cutting and fitting stone for an entire structure would take months. There had to be a solution using available materials and realistic labor. The answer came from an unexpected source. Not from studying successful buildings, but from examining a failed agricultural structure that somehow wasn't failing the way it should. In late January, Ezra was checking trap lines along a creek 4 miles south of his cabin when he came across the remains of an old homestead. Someone had attempted to establish a farm here years earlier and abandoned it. The cabin had collapsed, its roof caved in and walls rotting. But near the ruined cabin stood a corncrib that was still mostly intact. Corncribs were simple structures designed to store dried corn. They were built with horizontal wooden slats spaced 2 to 3 inches apart, allowing air to circulate through the stored grain and prevent rot. This particular crib was about 8 feet square and 10 feet tall, constructed from rough-cut lumber that had weathered to gray. Most of the slats were still in place, creating a cage-like structure open to the elements. Ezra almost walked past it, but something made him stop. It was mid-afternoon, temperature around 15 below zero, with a steady wind blowing from the north. He noticed that the snow inside the corncrib looked different from the snow outside. Outside, the wind was creating drifts and blowing loose powder around. Inside the crib, the snow was settled and undisturbed. He stepped closer and put his hand between the slats. The air inside felt less cold than the air outside, not warm, but noticeably less brutal. He walked around the structure, examining it from all sides. The slats created hundreds of small gaps. Wind should have blown straight through, but it didn't. The multiple layers of slats, each one creating a small barrier, disrupted the wind's flow. Air moved through the structure, but slowly, losing force as it navigated the maze of wooden barriers. Ezra climbed inside the crib through a gap where several slats had fallen away. Standing in the center, surrounded by slatted walls, he felt immediate relief from the wind. The temperature was still well below zero, but without wind cutting through his clothing, the cold was more bearable. He stayed inside for several minutes, thinking. The corncrib wasn't designed for warmth. It was designed for air circulation. But the way it broke up wind flow created an unintended consequence. The air inside was calmer, and calm air felt less cold than moving air even at the same temperature. More importantly, the multiple layers of slats with gaps between them created something interesting. Each gap held a pocket of relatively still air. Those air pockets weren't warm, but they weren't being constantly replaced by fresh cold air either. Ezra had learned basic physics from his father. Air itself was a poor conductor of heat. Still, air actually insulated better than many solid materials. The problem with air was that it moved. Wind carried heat away through convection. But if you could trap air in small pockets, preventing movement, it became an effective insulator. He examined the Corncrib's construction more carefully. The slats were roughly 2 inches thick, spaced about 3 inches apart. The gaps between slats created air pockets that disrupted wind flow, but the structure was open top and bottom, so the effect was limited. Ezra spent that evening in his cabin thinking about the Corncrib. The structure demonstrated a principle he hadn't considered before. Multiple barriers with air gaps between them could disrupt heat loss more effectively than a single solid barrier. His cabin walls were solid logs. Heat conducted straight through them from warm interior to cold exterior. But what if the walls weren't solid? What if there were air gaps built into the wall structure itself? The problem with his current cabin was that it had gaps in the wrong places. The chinking between logs created unintentional gaps that let air flow through, carrying heat away. But what if he built intentional gaps that trapped air without allowing flow? Gaps that were sealed on both sides but contained dead airspace in between? He thought about double-layered construction. What if he built a wall, left a gap, then built another wall? The air trapped between the two walls would insulate the interior from exterior cold. But building double walls would require twice the logs, twice the labor, and the inner wall would reduce interior space significantly, unless he didn't build the inner wall, unless he used something that was already built, something like a corncrib. The idea seemed absurd at first. Build a cabin around a corncrib? Use agricultural waste as the core of a dwelling? But the more Ezra thought about it, the more sense it made. A corncrib was already constructed with horizontal slats creating multiple air pockets. If he built solid log walls around the outside of a corncrib, leaving a gap between the slatted inner structure and the solid outer walls, he would create exactly what he wanted: multiple layers of trapped air surrounding a central living space. The slatted corncrib walls would provide structural support and create the first layer of air pockets. The gap between corncrib and outer walls would create a second, larger air pocket. The solid outer walls would seal everything and prevent exterior wind from penetrating. Heat from inside would have to travel through multiple air barriers before reaching the cold outside, and each barrier would slow the heat loss. It would look strange. The cabin would need to be larger than normal to accommodate the corncrib core, plus the outer walls, plus the gap between them. And he would probably need to leave part of the corncrib exposed at the top for ventilation, creating a tower-like structure rising from the roof. People would think it looked ridiculous. But if it worked, if it actually held heat the way he thought it would, appearance wouldn't matter. Function would prove itself through survival. Ezra had learned that lesson watching Lemuel die. Conventional methods weren't adequate. Doing what everyone else did meant accepting the same risks and limitations everyone else accepted. He needed to test the principle, but testing would require building an actual structure, which meant committing significant time and labor to an unproven idea. In early February, Ezra traveled to the nearest trading post, a rough collection of buildings 40 miles southeast. The trip took 3 days through deep snow. He needed supplies he couldn't produce himself, and he needed to talk through his idea with someone who might understand construction principles. The trading post was run by a man named Marcus Whitley, a former ship's carpenter who had come west and established himself as a supplier for trappers and occasional settlers. Ezra found him working on repairs to one of his storage buildings. He explained what he was thinking: double wall construction, corncrib core, air gap insulation. Marcus listened, asked a few questions about dimensions and materials, then gave his assessment. The principle was sound. Ships used similar concepts, building double hulls in some cases to protect against ice damage. The air gap between hulls provided insulation and structural redundancy. If Ezra could build it properly, maintaining consistent gaps and ensuring the outer walls were truly sealed, it should work better than standard construction. But Marcus also warned him. The labor would be substantial. He would need to either find an existing corn crib or build one, then construct an entire cabin around it. The time investment would be triple what normal cabin construction required. And other trappers would mock him mercilessly for building something so unconventional. Ezra didn't care about mockery. He cared about not freezing to death. He purchased basic supplies, nails, a few tools Marcus had available, and headed back to his territory. On the return journey, he detoured to the abandoned homestead where he had first examined the corn crib. He spent an hour measuring it, checking its structural integrity, and planning how he might incorporate it into a cabin design. The crib was sound. Some slats needed replacement, but the frame was solid. It was large enough that a cabin built around it would provide adequate interior space. The location was poor, too exposed and too far from good trapping territory. But he could disassemble the crib and move it. That decision made, Ezra began planning in detail. He would move the corn crib to a better location near his current camp. He would reassemble it, replacing damaged slats and reinforcing the frame. Then he would build cabin walls around it, leaving a gap of approximately 8 inches between the corn crib slats and the inner surface of the outer walls. That 8-inch gap would be his primary insulation barrier. He started talking about his plan with other trappers he encountered. The response was immediate and unanimous. They thought he was insane. Hiram Rafferty laughed out loud when Ezra described the concept. Build a cabin around a corn crib, waste 3 months on experimental construction when a normal cabin took less than a week, risk the entire spring trapping season on untested theory. Ezra began construction in mid-March of 1838. The timing was deliberate. Spring trapping season was starting, but he had decided to sacrifice immediate profit for long-term survival. If he could build a cabin that actually protected him from winter cold, the investment would pay for itself in reduced firewood needs and increased safety over many seasons. He selected a site half a mile from his current cabin on elevated ground with good drainage and clear sight lines. The location was close enough to his established trap lines, but offered better protection from prevailing winds. He spent 4 days clearing the site, removing brush and small trees, and leveling the ground where the cabin would sit. The abandoned corn crib required careful disassembly. Ezra returned to the old homestead with tools and rope. He numbered each slat with charcoal marks so he could reassemble the structure in its original configuration. The disassembly took 3 days. Transporting the materials to his new site took another week, making multiple trips to haul the slats, frame pieces, and support posts. Reassembly was more complex than he had anticipated. The corn crib had been built in place originally, and reconstructing it required precise measurement to ensure it remained square and plumb. Ezra worked slowly, checking each connection, replacing damaged slats with new ones he cut from standing timber. He reinforced the corner posts with additional bracing, knowing the structure would need to support not just itself, but also provide framework for the outer cabin walls. The reassembled corn crib stood 8 feet square and 9 feet tall. The slatted walls created a distinctive pattern, horizontal boards spaced 3 inches apart running the full height of the structure. The slats were 2 inches thick, rough cut but solid. The gaps between them allowed clear view from inside to outside, but the multiple layers created visual depth. Looking through the wall from an angle, You couldn't see through. Cleanly, the layers of slats obscured direct sight lines. Ezra built a simple roof frame over the corncrib to protect it during construction of the outer walls. He didn't complete the roof, just enough to keep rain off while he worked on the next phase. The top section of the corncrib, about 3 feet, he left exposed above where the outer cabin walls would terminate. This section would become the ventilation tower he had planned, allowing air circulation while maintaining the insulation properties of the lower structure. With the corncrib core in place, Ezra began laying out the foundation for the outer walls. He dug a shallow trench in a square pattern around the corncrib, leaving 8 inches of space on all sides between the trench and the corncrib walls. He filled the trench with rocks to create a level base, something most trappers never bothered with, but that Ezra knew would prevent settling and maintain structural integrity. The foundation work took another week. By early April, he had the corncrib erected and the foundation laid. The actual outer wall construction could now begin. He had invested 3 weeks so far with nothing to show for it that looked like a cabin. Ezra started cutting logs for the outer walls in mid-April. He was selective about which trees to use, choosing straight pines approximately 12 inches in diameter. He rejected trees with excessive taper or irregular growth. Each log needed to be as uniform as possible to create tight fits and minimal gaps. He spent 2 weeks cutting, limbing, and hauling logs to his construction site. Standard cabin construction used logs with bark left on. It was faster, and the bark provided minor additional insulation. Ezra stripped every log completely. He used a draw knife to remove bark and smooth the surface, creating clean wood that would fit more tightly against adjacent logs. The process was tedious. Each log required hours of work, but smooth, uniform logs would seal better than rough, bark-covered timber. He began raising the walls in early May. The first course of logs sat directly on his rock foundation. He notched the corners using a modified dovetail pattern that locked logs together more securely than standard saddle notches. Each log extended slightly past the corner, creating the traditional log cabin appearance, but the notching was tighter and more precise than typical frontier construction. The critical element was maintaining the 8-inch gap between the outer walls and the inner corncrib structure. Ezra used measuring sticks cut to exact length, checking constantly as he added each course of logs. The gap had to remain consistent. Too narrow, and the air pocket wouldn't provide adequate insulation. Too wide, and the outer walls wouldn't be properly supported by the foundation. As the walls rose, the structure began looking increasingly strange. The corncrib was visible through the growing outer walls, creating a cabin within a cabin appearance. Anyone watching could see the slatted inner structure surrounded by solid logs with a precise gap between them. It looked like Ezra was building a cage around another cage. He chinked the outer walls with exceptional care. Instead of using simple mud and moss, he mixed clay with horsehair and pine resin boiled down from sap. The mixture took days to prepare, but created a seal far superior to standard chinking. He packed it between logs while it was still pliable, creating an airtight barrier. As it dried, the horsehair reinforced the clay, the pine resin made it waterproof, and the combination adhered to the wood with remarkable strength. The walls rose slowly. Where a normal cabin could be raised in days, Ezra's construction was taking weeks. Each log required careful fitting, precise measurement of the air gap, and thorough chinking. By late May, the walls were 6 feet high. The corncrib's slatted structure was now completely surrounded by solid log walls with the 8-inch gap maintained all around. The dead airspace between the walls was the crucial element. Ezra understood that this trapped air would resist heat transfer. Warm air from his interior fireplace couldn't easily reach the outer walls because it had to cross the air gap first. Cold from outside couldn't penetrate inward because the air gap blocked conduction. The principle was simple, but the execution required precision. By early June, Ezra's outer walls had reached 7 feet in height. This was the point where he needed to make a decision about the roof and the Corncrib tower. Standard construction would cap the walls and build a roof over everything. But Ezra's design required leaving the top 3 feet of the corncrib exposed above the outer walls to serve as a ventilation tower. The tower concept was crucial to his design. Heat rises naturally through convection. In his double-wall cabin, warm air from the fireplace would heat the interior space, then rise into the top of the corncrib structure. From there, it needed a way to escape slowly rather than being trapped and creating moisture problems. The slatted tower would allow gradual air exchange while maintaining the insulation properties of the lower structure. He built the outer walls up to 7 feet, then began constructing the roof frame. The frame had to integrate with both the outer walls and the corncrib tower. He used heavy ridge poles spanning the width of the outer walls, creating a peaked roof structure. But at the center, where the corncrib tower rose, he left an opening that allowed the slatted structure to extend through the roof. The tower projected 3 feet above the roof line. The slatted construction continued all the way up, creating a distinctive cage-like appearance. Ezra built a small cap for the tower to prevent rain from entering directly while still allowing air circulation through the slats. The result was unlike anything anyone in the area had seen before. Word had spread among the local trapping community about Ezra's strange construction project. Men started making excuses to travel past his site to see what he was building. The reaction was universally negative. The cabin looked absurd. The tower, rising from the center of the roof, served no purpose anyone could understand. The double-wall construction seemed like wasted effort. The careful chinking and log fitting appeared to be obsessive perfectionism with no practical benefit. Hiram Rafferty visited in mid-June and spent an hour examining the structure. He walked around it multiple times, looking at the tower, peering into the 8-inch gap between walls, testing the chinking with his knife. Finally, he turned to Ezra and delivered his verdict. It was the most foolish waste of time and materials he had ever seen. The tower would collect snow and rain. The double walls served no purpose. The air gap would just trap moisture and rot the logs from inside. Ezra had spent 3 months building something that would fail within 2 years. Other trappers echoed Hiram's assessment. They started calling it Coldwell's Folly. Some called it the Corncrib Castle. Jethro Crane, usually a diplomatic man, told Ezra privately that he had made a serious mistake. The construction had consumed the entire spring trapping season. Ezra's pelt count for the year would be minimal. He had invested enormous labor in an experimental design that probably wouldn't work. And even if it did work marginally better than a standard cabin, the improvement wouldn't justify the time invested. Ezra listened to all the criticism without argument. He had no proof yet that his design would work. He could explain the theory of air gap insulation, but theory meant nothing to practical men who had survived in the mountains for years using conventional methods. Ezra completed the roof in early July. He used a multi-layer approach similar to his wall construction philosophy. Ridge poles spanned the outer walls at 18-inch intervals, much closer than standard construction. Over these he laid split planks, each one carefully fitted to overlap the next like shingles. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles using wooden pegs he had whittled during evening hours over the previous weeks. Over the planks he laid birch bark in multiple overlapping layers. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible. But Ezra didn't trust it alone. Over the bark he spread his clay mixture, creating a seal that covered every potential leak point. Finally, over the entire roof, he laid sod with living grass and soil that would root and create a living roof. The multiple layers made the roof extremely heavy, but the robust wall construction supported the weight easily. The door required special attention. Standard cabin doors were simple planks held together with crosspieces. Ezra built his door from thick planks fitted with tongue and groove joints, creating a door that was effectively a single solid piece. He reinforced it with iron brackets he had purchased at the trading post, creating an X pattern across the interior face. The door weighed nearly 70 pounds but was rigid and strong. He mounted the door using heavy iron hinges, also purchased from Marcus Whitley. The hinges were mortised into both the door and the log door frame, creating connections that couldn't be torn free without destroying the logs themselves. He added a locking bar that slid horizontally through iron brackets into a mortise cut into the adjacent wall log, connecting the door directly to the wall structure. Windows presented a challenge. Ezra wanted light and ventilation but needed to maintain his insulation principles. He cut 2 small window openings in the outer wall only, not penetrating through to the corncrib. Each opening was only 10 inches by 12 inches, placed high on the wall. He created shutters from thick planks reinforced with iron brackets, matching his door construction. The shutters were hinged on the interior and could be secured with wooden bars. Behind each shutter, he installed heavy canvas stretched across the opening and tacked to the interior wall. He applied his clay mixture to the canvas, building up layers until the canvas was embedded in a half-inch thick layer of waterproof compound. The result was translucent, allowing diffused light even when shutters were open, and far stronger than the rawhide most trappers used. Inside, Ezra built a proper stone fireplace in one corner, spending a week gathering flat stones and constructing it with a chimney that extended above the roofline. The chimney was narrow, too narrow for anything to climb down, and included a smoke shelf that prevented downdrafts. He built a sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the ground, storage shelves mounted high on the walls, and a small table using careful joinery throughout. By late July, the cabin was complete. It had taken 4 months of nearly continuous work. Ezra had sacrificed the entire spring trapping season. His pelt count for 1838 would be his worst since arriving in the mountains. But he had built something unprecedented. Ezra moved his supplies into the completed cabin in early August of 1838. The interior space measured roughly 12 feet square, smaller than his previous cabin due to the double-wall construction consuming exterior dimensions. But the space felt different. The walls were solid and tight. No drafts moved through gaps in the chinking. The multiple layers created a sense of enclosure that standard cabins lacked. He lit his first fire in the new fireplace on a cool August evening when the temperature dropped into the 40s. The fire drew well, with smoke venting cleanly through the chimney. Within an hour, the interior temperature had climbed noticeably. Ezra paid attention to how the warmth distributed through the space. Heat radiated from the fireplace as expected, but it seemed to linger in the air rather than immediately escaping through the walls. He let the fire die down to coals and waited. In his old cabin, warmth would have dissipated within an hour or 2. In this structure, the temperature dropped more slowly. After 3 hours with just coals in the fireplace, the cabin still felt comfortable. The air was still warm enough that he didn't need his heavy coat. Hiram Rafferty visited in mid-August to see the finished structure. He arrived with Jethro Crane and 2 other trappers from nearby camps. They walked around the exterior examining the construction. The tower, rising from the center of the roof, drew particular attention and mockery. It looked like a corncrib had grown out of the cabin's head, one man said. Another suggested Ezra could store grain up there, at least getting some use from the foolish addition. Hiram tested the door, pushing on it to check the strength. It didn't budge. He examined the windows, the shutters, the chinking between logs. He admitted the construction quality was exceptional. The logs were fitted more precisely than he had ever seen in frontier building. The chinking was thorough and well applied. The door and shutters were built like fortress gates. But all that quality was wasted on a flawed design. The fundamental problem, Hiram explained to the assembled trappers, was the air gap between the walls. Ezra claimed it would trap heat. But Hiram knew from experience that air moved. Heat rose and escaped, cold settled and penetrated. The gap would just create a channel for air circulation that would rob warmth from the interior. By spring, moisture would accumulate in that gap and rot the logs from the inside out. The tower would collect snow that would melt and drain into the wall cavity. The whole structure would fail within 2 years. Ezra asked Hiram what he thought would happen during winter. Hiram's prediction was simple and confident. The cabin would be colder than a standard structure because heat would escape into the wall gap. Ezra would burn more firewood trying to compensate. By midwinter, he would abandon the cabin and build a conventional structure. The Corncrib castle would stand empty as a monument to wasted effort. The other trappers agreed with Hiram's assessment. Jethro Crane, who respected Ezra's skills, suggested he had overthought the problem. Sometimes simple solutions were best. A standard cabin built with care would serve adequately. All the extra complexity Ezra had added was unnecessary. Winter arrived early in 1838. By late October, temperatures were regularly dropping below freezing at night. Ezra prepared for the season with careful attention to firewood supplies. He cut and stacked wood as he always had, though he suspected he might need less than previous years. He stocked food and supplies for a long winter. By early November, he was ready. The first serious cold came in mid-November. Temperature dropped to 10 below zero overnight. Ezra built a fire in his fireplace before sunset using moderate amounts of wood to establish a good bed of coals. He kept the fire going until around 9 in the evening, then let it die down naturally. He went to sleep with just coals glowing in the fireplace. He woke at dawn. The coals had gone completely cold hours earlier. But the cabin interior was still warm enough that he could see his breath only faintly. He estimated the temperature at around 40 degrees. Outside, it was 12 below zero. The cabin had maintained a 52-degree differential overnight with no active fire. In his old cabin, the interior would have dropped to near freezing within 2 hours of the fire going out. Ezra would have needed to wake multiple times during the night to add wood. Here, the heat was persisting for 8 or 9 hours after he stopped feeding the fire. The air gap was working exactly as he had theorized. He experimented over the next few weeks, testing how the cabin responded to different fire management approaches. He found he could maintain comfortable interior temperatures using roughly half the firewood he had burned in previous winters. A moderate fire in the evening would keep the cabin warm until morning. During the day, a small fire was enough to maintain comfort even when outside temperatures were well below zero. The tower proved to be crucial for ventilation. Warm air rose through the interior space, circulated through the top of the corncrib structure, and vented slowly through the slatted tower. This created a gentle air exchange that prevented moisture buildup while not creating drafts. The system was self-regulating. When the interior warmed significantly, circulation increased. When temperatures dropped, circulation slowed. By December, Ezra was convinced his design had succeeded. The cabin was warmer, more comfortable, and more fuel-efficient than anything he had lived in before. But he had no way to prove this to skeptics. He could explain what he was experiencing, but other trappers would assume he was exaggerating or deluding himself. The proof would come in January, during the coldest part of winter, when temperature differentials would be most dramatic. Ezra waited for a truly brutal cold spell, the kind that tested every structure and every man's preparations. It arrived on January 12, 1839. Temperature dropped to 42 below zero overnight. Ezra went to sleep with a moderate fire burning. He woke once around midnight to check the fire, found it had reduced to coals, and went back to sleep without adding wood. When he woke at dawn, the interior temperature was still comfortable. He estimated 45 degrees inside with 42 below outside. An 87-degree differential. 3 days into the severe cold spell, Hiram Rafferty appeared at Ezra's door mid-morning. He looked exhausted. His beard was crusted with ice. His hands were wrapped in extra layers of cloth to protect against frostbite. He had walked the 300 yards from his cabin to Ezra's through temperature that was still 38 below zero. Ezra opened the door and warm air rushed out into the brutal cold. Hiram stepped inside quickly, and Ezra shut the door behind him. Hiram stood in the entry for a moment, not speaking, just absorbing the warmth. He unwrapped his hands and held them out toward the fireplace where a small fire was burning. After several minutes, he finally spoke. How was the cabin so warm? Ezra had let his fire die down to minimal coals hours earlier. He had added just a few small pieces of wood when he woke to provide enough flame for making coffee. The fire was small, nothing like the roaring blaze Hiram maintained in his own cabin. Yet Ezra's interior temperature was comfortable enough that he was wearing just a wool shirt. No heavy coat, no furs, no layers of insulation. Hiram walked around the interior, touching walls, examining the fireplace, looking up at the ceiling where the Corncrib tower extended through the roof. He asked about firewood consumption. Ezra showed him the woodpile outside. Hiram had started winter with approximately the same amount of wood. His pile was nearly half depleted. Ezra's was barely touched. The evidence was undeniable. The cabin worked. The air gap was insulating exactly as Ezra had predicted. The tower was venting moisture without creating excessive heat loss. The careful construction was maintaining an interior environment that was fundamentally different from standard cabins. Hiram spent an hour in Ezra's cabin, warming himself, drinking coffee, and asking technical questions. How thick was the air gap? 8 inches. What was in the chinking? Clay, horsehair, pine resin? How did the tower not fill with snow? The slatted design allowed snow to fall through rather than accumulating. Could this design be replicated? Yes, if someone was willing to invest the time and labor. When Hiram finally left to return to his own cabin, he said something Ezra hadn't expected. He admitted he had been wrong. The design worked. The mockery had been misplaced. If Ezra was willing to help, Hiram wanted to build a similar cabin next summer. Over the following weeks, other trappers visited during the cold spell. Each one had the same reaction: shock at the interior warmth, questions about the construction, admission that the unconventional design was succeeding where conventional methods barely sufficed. Jethro Crane visited in late January and asked Ezra to measure the exact temperature differential. They used Ezra's thermometer to check outside temperature, 41 below, and estimated interior temperature at 46 above, an 87-degree difference. Even accounting for measurement uncertainty, the gap was clearly more than 80 degrees. But Ezra suggested a more practical measurement. He and Jethro went to Hiram's cabin 300 yards away. Inside, with a large fire roaring, the temperature was approximately 33 degrees. Outside was still 41 below, a 74-degree differential. Hiram was burning 3 times as much wood as Ezra and achieving 13 degrees less interior warmth. Jethro Crane left the mountains in March of 1839 and returned in June with specific plans. He had spent the spring in St. Louis, selling his furs and purchasing materials. He brought back iron hardware, nails, tools, and detailed measurements he had written down during his January visit to Ezra's cabin. He intended to build his own double-wall cabin before the next winter. Jethro's situation was different from Ezra's. He didn't have an existing corncrib to use as an interior core. He would need to build the inner structure from scratch. Ezra helped him plan the construction. The inner wall didn't need to be slatted like a corncrib. It just needed to create air pockets. They designed a system using vertical boards spaced 3 inches apart, creating a slatted inner wall that would function similarly to the corncrib. Construction began in early July. Jethro built the inner slatted wall first, creating an 8-foot square structure 7 feet tall. The vertical slats were 2 inches thick, spaced precisely 3 inches apart. The gaps allowed air circulation, while the multiple layers of boards created dead air pockets that would resist heat transfer. He left the top open, planning to integrate it with a ventilation system similar to Ezra's tower. Around this inner structure, Jethro built solid log walls, maintaining an 8-inch gap. He used Ezra's techniques for log selection, stripping, and fitting. He mixed his own batch of clay horsehair resin chinking, following Ezra's formula. He built a reinforced door and shuttered windows. By September, he had completed a cabin that incorporated Ezra's insulation principles in a modified design. The work had consumed his entire summer trapping season. Other trappers who saw what Jethro was building responded with the same mockery Ezra had faced. But Jethro had experienced Ezra's cabin during the January cold spell. He knew the design worked. He was willing to sacrifice one season's income for long-term survival advantage. When winter arrived, Jethro's cabin performed as expected. Not quite as efficiently as Ezra's original design, the Corncrib's horizontal slats apparently created better air pocket geometry than vertical boards, but dramatically better than standard construction. Jethro reported maintaining comfortable temperatures using approximately 60% of the firewood his previous cabin had required. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. By the spring of 1840, several other trappers were planning similar construction. Some tried to replicate Ezra's corncrib design. Others used Jethro's vertical slat approach. A few invented their own variations, experimenting with different air gap widths and inner wall configurations. The technique acquired a name. Trappers started calling them Coldwell cabins after Ezra's surname. The name stuck despite Ezra never claiming credit or trying to profit from his innovation. He shared his techniques freely with anyone who asked. He helped other trappers with construction advice, measurements, and material recommendations. His goal had never been recognition. He simply wanted to survive mountain winters without constant misery and danger. By 1842, there were at least a dozen Coldwell-style cabins scattered across the northern Rockies. Each one represented a trapper who had decided the extra labor investment was worthwhile for the dramatic improvement in winter comfort and safety. The design was spreading organically through the community, passed from builder to builder through observation and conversation. The Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed between 1840 and 1845. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in accessible areas. More significantly, fashion had shifted. Silk replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying demand for the pelts that had driven men into the wilderness. Prices at summer rendezvous dropped precipitously. By 1844, the rendezvous system had ended entirely. Trappers began leaving the mountains. Ezra left in spring of 1845. He was 34 years old and had spent 11 years in the Rockies. He had saved money during his trapping career, enough to purchase land in the Oregon Territory, where settlers were establishing farms in the Willamette Valley. He sold his trapping equipment, packed his essential possessions, and joined a wagon train heading west. He left his cabin standing. It seemed wrong to tear down something that had worked so well, and other trappers or travelers might find use for it. The structure had survived 7 winters without significant deterioration. The logs remained solid, the chinking intact, the roof waterproof. The air gap showed no signs of the moisture rot that Hiram had predicted. The tower still vented properly, keeping the interior dry. Other trappers were making similar decisions, abandoning the mountains as the economic foundation of their lifestyle disappeared. But the cabins remained. Double wall structures scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness, built by men who had learned that conventional methods were inadequate, and that unconventional solutions could work if properly executed. Some cabins were occupied by new inhabitants. A few settlers moving into the territories discovered abandoned Coldwell cabins and recognized their superior construction. They moved in, maintained the structures, and survived winters more comfortably than neighbors in standard cabins. Some cabins served as way stations for travelers, offering shelter that was notably warmer than typical frontier structures. The technique continued spreading even after the original builders left. Settlers asked questions about the strange double-wall cabins they found. Trappers who stayed in the mountains shared construction details with newcomers. The phrase, "built like a Coldwell cabin," became a complement in frontier communities, signifying construction quality and thermal efficiency. No formal documentation existed. Ezra never wrote down his techniques. Jethro never published plans. The knowledge spread entirely through oral tradition and direct observation. A settler would see a double-wall cabin, recognize its advantages, and attempt to replicate the design. Sometimes the replications were accurate. Sometimes builders misunderstood key principles and built inferior versions. But the core concept, air gap insulation using available materials, proved resilient enough that even imperfect implementations offered improvement over standard construction. By 1850, scattered examples of double-wall cabins existed throughout the northern Rockies and into the Oregon Territory. Most builders didn't know Ezra Coldwell's name. They knew the technique as the Corncrib method, or double-wall building, or simply the warm cabin design. The innovation had separated from its inventor, becoming anonymous practical knowledge passed between people who needed better shelter. Ezra Coldwell established a small ranch in the Willamette Valley in 1846. He married a widow named Catherine Brennan in 1847. They had 3 children over the next 8 years. Ezra raised cattle and horses, built barns and fences, and lived the quiet life of a frontier farmer. He never returned to the mountains. He died in 1871 at age 60 of pneumonia following a winter illness. His family buried him in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone listed his name, birth, and death years, and the simple inscription, "Beloved husband and father." Nothing mentioned his trapping years or the cabin design that had spread across the Rockies. To his family, he was simply a rancher who had lived a good, unremarkable life. But in the mountains, structures built using his principles continued standing. Some lasted decades. A few survived into the 20th century, eventually discovered by historians studying frontier architecture. The double-wall construction confused researchers initially. Why build such complex structures in remote wilderness? Analysis eventually revealed the thermal efficiency advantages, and researchers recognized the innovation represented in these scattered cabins. The technical specifications documented by later historians showed the magnitude of improvement. Standard 1830s mountain cabins maintained interior temperatures approximately 20 to 30 degrees above exterior temperatures when fires were actively burning. Within 2 hours of fires dying, interior temperatures dropped to near exterior levels. Fuel consumption was enormous, with single cabins requiring multiple cords of firewood per winter. Coldwell-style cabins maintained interior temperatures 40 to 50 degrees above exterior. Temperatures with moderate fires. Heat retention continued 6 to 10 hours after fires died completely. Fuel consumption was approximately 50% of standard construction. The difference was sufficient to transform winter survival from constant struggle to manageable routine. The principle Ezra had discovered, air gap insulation using readily available materials, eventually became standard in building construction. Modern homes use the same concept with manufactured insulation materials filling wall cavities. But the fundamental physics remain identical. Trapped air resists heat transfer. Multiple barriers slow thermal conduction. Proper ventilation prevents moisture accumulation. Ezra had understood these principles through observation and experimentation, applying them with materials at hand. The story of how one trapper's response to his partner's death created a construction innovation that spread across a region illustrates how frontier knowledge developed. No formal education, no published research, no institutional support, just observation, reasoning, experimentation, and willingness to invest effort in unproven ideas. The solution required no new technology, only existing materials used with intelligence and care. Several dozen lives were likely saved over subsequent decades because people built cabins that could withstand extreme cold. The exact number is unknowable. Survival doesn't generate records the way death does, but accounts from the period reference people surviving brutal winters, specifically because their cabins held heat, and those accounts often describe double-wall construction matching Coldwell's principles. The innovation outlasted its inventor. The knowledge outlasted the industry that produced it. And scattered across the Rocky Mountains, weathered structures still stood decades later, silent testimony to what observation and determination could accomplish on the American frontier.